Okay, very good. Well, welcome everybody. It's nice to see you all. And let me start another one of these conversations by acknowledging the National Science Foundation, who's partially funding this effort, and of course the organizers, Linda Boyle, John Lee, Rafaela Sadoun, Manfred Chalagi, and Orit Sher and myself are here today. And just logistics, this is a recorded 30 minutes roughly conversation. If you have questions, please put them in the chat and or it will help with the questions. And so we're very happy to welcome Bastian Pfleging, a collaborator and a friend for a long while now. So Bastian is assistant professor for design research at Eindhoven University of Technology. He has a background in computer science and expertise in the general field of human-computer interaction, ubiquitous computing, multimodal interaction, natural user interfaces, and he's very active in the automotive user interfaces community. He's also one of the members of the steering committee of the ACM Sakai Automotive UI conference series. So welcome, Bastian. It's great to have you. Thanks for agreeing to talk to us. And so this is a conversation about the future of work, and you have this really interesting paper in 2016. It's quite influential too, very highly cited, and you were interested in predicting user needs for automated vehicles. So I wanted to ask you, what have you learned back then? What do you think people will want to do if they have automated vehicles?
Yeah, well, I mean, thanks for the introduction, first of all. And I think this is a really kind of, we already did quite some work on this topic, and other people as well, obviously. And I think we have some ideas of what people might want to do in the future. Yeah, I'm looking at that original paper. So we really try to approach this from different perspectives, because even today, we still have, to a larger extent, really this challenge that it's more or less like a chicken and egg problem, because most people haven't used the technology so far. So, I mean, they know some ideas of an automated car, how it is sort of advertised in the news and so on, but it is very difficult for people to imagine how it really looks like and feels like driving in such a car. And so obviously it's like when you ask people about it, it is very difficult to understand, or like for them to understand the situation, and in that sense, envision how they expect to be using such a vehicle in the future. And so with this sort of warning upfront, one of these activities which we still did is we tried to describe it as good as possible to people, such a scenario, and we did first of all an online survey where we really tried to understand, I mean, explain that situation, and then ask people about what kind of activities they actually envision. We already came up with quite some activities, and then we also allowed them to add kind of like what else they think they then would be doing in such a car. And then in addition, so we only use that sort of as a first pointer to really understand sort of what could be the tendencies for people to do such activities in future cars. And then we actually thought about, so what are situations where people already today basically are in some sort of travel situation where they don't have to drive themselves. And so what people obviously do very commonly is that they take public transportation. And so we actually did two different studies. So one was actually interviews in sort of suburban trains, and also sort of observational studies in subways in Munich at that time, where we really looked at, so what are people doing when they don't need to drive themselves, to get an idea and see how this actually matches between what we observed and what we saw in our surveys. And I think with that, we have now sort of an idea as a starting point to design and understand which activities to really build for future vehicles. But of course, this is only sort of a first glimpse into the future, because I guess a few of you might know this sort of task artifact cycle concept, that typically when we build and design technology, we do that because there is a specific need for something that needs to be solved. And in that case, the idea is really, of course, that we want to solve what people are doing when the car is driving itself, and that we can offer them alternatives, tasks, so be it for work, be it for relaxation, be it for entertainment. But what we then see is very clear in many cases that these needs actually, when people start using the technology, they will actually change. So a good example is, I think, if you have a look at the mobile phone. So if you would have asked people 15 years ago, what would you do with a mobile phone? They would have said, yes, I would call my friends. I would be kind of available on a regular phone number. People would send me text messages. Nobody would have said sort of, I book my airline tickets on my mobile phone, and I kind of, I don't know, I do video conferences and I use it for navigation. So there's a lot of ideas really which only came up by using these devices. And I mean, today I would guess I have a few colleagues who they don't even know their way home if they don't have their mobile phone with Google Maps on running, because we just depend so much on technology. So we see that really these needs change, and in that sense, we need to find ways of really understanding better how to do that. And with actually the second paper, I guess, which we're talking about in a minute, where we did that Wizard of Oz study, I think we get one step closer, but still, I think this is sort of a continuous process until we have the technology available and we see how people really use it. And then again, I think there will be changes. But I think, I mean, the interesting thing also comparing it with a mobile phone is if we have a look at that switch from, I don't know, having the regular phone, having the mobile phone. So this was really a huge step because we got rid of the cables and you could use it in a mobile setup. And then at the second step, when Apple introduced the iPhone, this concept of apps and using additional activities on the phone was yet another huge step, where it was not just that incremental change, but like a larger change. So they envisioned it, even though I assume that Apple didn't have all the ideas, of course, of what we use as apps on our mobile phones today. So we see there's sort of, on the one hand, an iterative process. On the other hand, also sometimes you need to have these sort of visionary steps from one device and design to another one. And kind of, I think this is now the first step that we need to do, really one of these visionary ideas and concepts of how to do that. And then we need to see how situations evolve in the future.
Yeah. So you already alluded to this follow-up study that I really wanted to ask you about. And so you had a Wizard of Oz study, Wizard of Oz automated driving. So the first question I wanted to ask is, what does it mean to have Wizard of Oz when you have an experiment with automated driving? Can you tell us more about that, the method that you employed here?
Yes, so the method itself, I think this is an attempt to make people believe they sit in an automated vehicle, or they don't only sit in but they are driving in an automated vehicle, so that they really get this feeling of sitting in such a car and using it in a way how we envision it to be used when these cars really exist and are available in the market, while we actually have a human driver who's operating that car. So sitting in the front and basically really doing the regular traditional driving task. But this person is basically hidden to the participants so that they don't see that person. And you basically have to deceive the participants to say, well, this car is driving automated, even though the human driver actually is driving. And I mean, that, of course, involves a lot of challenges, because on the one hand, like from an ethical perspective, we need to decide and see how to deal with this situation that we actually are deceiving people and that this is happening in an appropriate and acceptable way. But of course, also there's other aspects because people see that there's a human driver inside of the car. And then the question is really, so when we do this kind of experiments, so is it, let's say, if we're doing things about trust, understanding how people trust automation. So is it now real trust because of the system, or is it trust that because there is a human backup driver? Because in our case, we actually did not fully deceive them. So we said there is a human driver in front, which actually also picked up the people. So they explained the technology, and then we sold it in a way that this person is there as a backup driver who interferes if necessary. Which especially is required, let's say, when you park and sort of like when picking up and dropping off people, so that they clearly were seeing, okay, if that person is driving around, kind of while they arrive at my place, this is sort of the situation when it's okay that the person is driving, but for the rest, they were we said that the car is driving itself. And I mean, looking at the study, in the end, we figured out that a lot of people actually believed this deception until the very end. But of course, there was, I don't know, remember the exact number, I think like 3 or 4 people who actually had an idea that the human person in front of the car actually was driving himself. So there's quite a few of these challenges. And what I also found interesting, so I mean, Susanne is here in the meeting as well. So at Mobile HCI, we had an inspiring talk also by Dietrich Mannstetten from Bosch, who also do similar studies like this. And so what he expressed there, I think one of these challenges is if people know about this deception, and I don't know, other people might hear about this in the future. The question is, how can you keep up this sort of deception also for future experiments? So if there's a follow-up experiment, maybe you can only do it with people who don't know about your prior research, which of course also limits then the number of people available for your studies.
That's really interesting. And so I guess, what did you find out? So building on that 2016 knowledge, what else did you find out? What do we know now that we didn't know before?
Yeah, I mean, so what we did in the study is actually so different things. On the one hand, we really looked at, so the ideas, what people do in the car to kind of confirm or update how things actually are like when people drive in such a car. Just looking back at 2016, what we actually found in the original paper was that on the one hand, we really need to support a multitude of activities, so related especially to communication, relaxation, but also dining, office work, maybe sleeping, but these were sort of the tasks which people originally were thinking of. And so on the one hand, we really, I mean, we drove people around, and also we did that 6 times per participant, so that that there was sort of a process of getting used to this technology. And so we looked at what people were doing in the car. So that was one thing we did. And in addition, we also looked at aspects sort of, on the one hand, we interviewed them also beforehand and afterwards about automated driving in general, how they envision to use such technology. But we also tried to understand how acceptance and trust change also over time. So before the experiment, and then kind of in the course of the experiment until the very last drive. And when we look at the non-driving activities that we actually observed, I think it's quite interesting. So there was some things where our studies that we did beforehand align very well with what we observed. But of course, there's also quite a few differences. So for instance, like watching out of the window seems to be, especially in our case, was still one of the major activities. But of course, we see that there could be different reasons why people did this, of course. So, and one is maybe, especially in the beginning, they were really kind of, they wanted to observe what's going on, and they were not yet fully trusting the system and sort of like just trying to understand what's going on. And obviously, then you rather observe the situation. I mean, there was also, let's say, a sort of an emergency button, which if they would have pressed it, the driver would have stopped the car immediately. So maybe that was at the beginning something which was happening. But I think then in general also so when we look at the duration of these drives, so many of the people use the car for roughly 20 minutes per ride. And this is not a long time. So let's say if you envision, you say, well, I want to watch a movie which lasts 1.5 hours. Probably this is not the task which you're going to do on the way back from work, because you're just interrupted. And so that might just not create the best experience. So you think about smaller tasks, and that's what we actually also saw then in the car. Yeah, so people communicate, so they use their mobile phone, they do activities on their phone, even like, I don't know, doing all kind of things of like cosmetics, dressing up, dining, stuff like that. So there was quite a few activities in there. And I think the underlying message here is really, if we want to design vehicles, especially in a situation where we have situations where the driver might need to take over, I think the challenge here is really that we support as many activities as possible, because if we design these activities inside the car from a manufacturer's perspective, we can ensure that so these tasks are still compatible with the requiring remaining driving task demands. And so that's why I consider this being very essential, that we have a look at what possible activities are there, and that we try to support as many of them as possible. And then looking at trust and acceptance, I think what was interesting is with regard to acceptance. First of all, it did not really change throughout the experiment, which I think was sort of remarkable. When we have a look at the trust rating. So what we saw is, so we actually asked the people afterwards, so when they rated the trust, whether they actually sort of just rated the system itself, so the car itself, or whether they actually also rated this idea that there was a safety driver present who could have intervened. And so what we see is that like the trust ratings were slightly higher for those cases where people said, well, I rate sort of the combination of safety driver and automation, but that was not significant. So it was only a smaller trend. And I think in general, this is really kind of interesting, kind of that, especially when people see that there is this human fallback option, that this might increase trust. So the idea of teleoperator driving, yeah, could be something which really is something which people are in favor of if they see that they don't have to take over themselves. And I think also this gradual process of getting used, this is something which we could look into more. So really to see over a longer period how really people's behavior change if they use such automated vehicles.
Great, thank you. And I think kind of this is a great segue for questions, because that will allow us to kind of dive deeper into the different aspects. So maybe I'm going to start with, not necessarily in the order, so I'm going to start with Thomas, because Thomas had a question about personal activities and context, and then we'll kind of transition with questions that deal with handover. Thomas?
Yes, I was wondering, you were saying that you were doing this actual observations in public transport to see what people do when they actually are not in control of the vehicle they are actually using. And you were looking at these particular activities, but I believe that people are doing activities in the public where they feel comfortable with. And I was interested in, have you also looked what is different between the activities people feel comfortable with in public transport and in private spaces, which I would have, for example, when driving an automated vehicle?
Yeah, Thomas, thanks for the question. I think that's a good point, and that's, I think, also what really will be the distinguishing point between public transportation, or maybe also shared mobility in the future, and private vehicles. That, yeah, so people do different things in the car. So I think as a sort of starting point, that's why we actually did these observations in public transportations. Is we said that this is probably a subset of activities which also is interesting for the car. So what people do in public transportation is what we can also offer in the cars, but there may be additional activities on top of this. And I think especially when it comes to conversations, so like really phone calls, for instance, that is something where we expect that this is going to happen more frequently. And also looking at, let's say, the business side. So yeah, I guess most of us, well, we're academics, so it's not that's challenging for a lot of us. But if you're working in industry, I guess you rarely will open your laptop in the subway to start writing the next email, which is something which is clearly possible if you drive yourself in an automated vehicle.
Thank you.
Sorry, so maybe let's think about, Guillermo had a question about the difference between autonomous vehicles and semi-autonomous vehicle. Do you want to kind of jump in?
Yes. Well, how do I suppose that they will differ from current vehicles? I would hope that they actually differ a lot, because if you don't need to drive anymore yourself, I mean, we could imagine that you really adjust the interior of the vehicle for these activities. And I mean, if you compare, let's say, the driver's seat with my desk, how I have it over here, that's completely different. Or if you compare, let's say, the driver's seat with like your living room when you watch a movie or so. So these are clearly different with regard to, I don't know, seating positions, the interfaces, how you interact with it. So I guess that there is really a huge potential for redesigning and seeing the car as a platform for change in the future, where you can really think about adjusting it to the tasks which people do. So, and looking at especially also like what my colleagues in our department do. So thinking about, for instance, let's say shape changing interfaces, shape change in general, sort of interactive materials and so on. I think that there's a huge potential that we really make a kind of create a space which adapts to the current situation. Yeah, so maybe you still have that traditional driver's workspace when there is a risk of having to take over the car. But if you know that like the whole ride is completely automated, then the space might adjust to what is possible and adjust to your specific needs. So I think this is really the big potential for future systems, that it really adapts to the task, to the situation. And yeah, with that regard, I think, yeah, there's a lot of like a lot of space for opportunities, and we really need to see and align this with what is possible and what is allowed.
Right, thank you. So maybe we can move from tasks and possibilities to talk about handover. And Tim, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. Thanks, Bastian, for your talk. The question I have is in regards to that handover. So we have some students working on a project where they're trying to explore in a level 5 autonomous car that handover to allow the passengers to control the car for the last meters. So, for example, it might come to the shopping center, but maybe they need to pick something up from a loading dock, or maybe they need to pick up their friend who's not right at the very entrance of the parking lot. So they're trying to explore, how would that handover take place, and then perhaps interfaces to do that. Do you have any insights or ideas, or yeah, just curious to hear your thoughts.
Well, I mean, so basically the handover only happens really for the, I mean, not the last mile but for the last meters.
Yeah, or that's kind of the proposed scenario. We're saying, well, it'll probably show up, but maybe it doesn't go exactly where they want the car to go. So then we're thinking, well, there could be many ways that, we give them a joystick, or we give some kind of shared controls, or, maybe we borrow more from like the horse metaphor.
I think that's an interesting question. So looking at, I mean, when you first started asking the question, I thought about, well, maybe isn't it actually the let's say from an automation perspective, the complete difference? Because I mean, already today we have these, let's say, these fine-grained activities such as parking, which the car can do by itself. But what you say now, obviously, is a slightly different thing. It's not about the fact that the car is actually able to park where necessary, but more like that you want to give more detailed instructions on where to stop the car, where to park, and where to pick up people, which sometimes is more than just a sort of addressing, kind of entering the address where you want to go.
Right, more of like an ad hoc controls, so ad hoc activity, I guess.
And I think that is an essential aspect which I already wanted to have mentioned earlier, but which I actually forgot, because what we also figured out, so in many cases, really sort of talking about the acceptance, so what we got as feedback from people is really that this idea of autonomy, so that you decide what the car is doing, is an essential aspect for acceptance. And so in that sense, I would say that this is also very important. If you always have this, I don't know, like this tool on your computer, which supports you somehow in doing the task, but it always misspells your name or something, you really get annoyed about this activity. I think you could see this as a sort of counterpart then in the automotive domain, where you say, this is where we really need means to support the people really getting there where they want to get. And I don't know. I don't have a solution right now. Of course, like, I mean, you said sort of something like with regard to joysticks or so, maybe sort of more kind of a map-based approach, or kind of a virtual reality approach, where you can say, hey, this is where I want to go now. So I guess this is something which could be really useful. And actually, so also one observation which we made in our study. So I remember that one of the participants actually said, when we asked them about for which type of rides would you use an automatic vehicle, where she said, I probably would not take an automated vehicle to just get some bread at the bakery, because I'm much faster driving there than entering the destination. And I think that almost confirms that what you explain is really sort of necessary. So I mean, that sounds interesting to see what your students come up with as
Great.
concepts.
Thanks a lot. Thanks.
Great, thank you. And I know that Bastian had a question related also to handover.
Well, actually, it is not for handover, but thanks. So Bastian, I really liked that study. I thought it was very creative, how you did the deception. And my question is actually similar to Thomas's question, but from a different perspective. So when you look at the passengers of manually driven vehicles, right, and compare it to an AV scenario like you implemented when the novelty wears off, do we expect different type of behaviors other than speaking to the driver? So can we observe passengers now to make conclusions about AV passengers in the future?
I mean, one thing actually that we already also thought about, but which we did not do because of, let's say, logistical challenges, is that we actually said, let's observe passengers of taxis. Yeah, because I don't know, sitting at the back seat observing passengers of taxis, I think this would also be a very interesting insight in how people behave and what people do in such vehicles. But I think there's one difference between passengers of manually driven cars and passengers or drivers of automated vehicles, which is the driving style. Because if you have a look at how automated vehicles drive, and I mean, typically they try to kind of drive in a very kind of so far mostly defensive driving style, but also in a more yeah, I mean, with less acceleration and deceleration, which I would assume really is a huge benefit with regard to motion sickness. So if I remember, I mean, if I'm sitting in a taxi, and I mean, taxi drivers are typically not the let's say the most respectful drivers. I would guess that in many cases I would get motion sick when I start writing an email in a taxi. And I would hope that with a more with a smoother driving algorithm in an automated vehicle, that it's much more likely that I can do and that I can really write the email in an automated vehicle compared to a taxi. So I think that is one thing. And also the technology of how I do this clearly is a difference, because if I have a look at yeah, I don't know, like the taxi situation, talking again about writing emails, I would probably do that on a tablet or on a mobile phone or on my laptop, which means I need to look at that device, so I need to look down, I don't see the road. While if I would envision an ideal setup for a future automated vehicle, I expect that something like this would happen on windshield display. So you have a display where you see the road and kind of in front of it, so you have an overlay where you see the email, so you always see the surrounding, which helps you kind of, on the one hand, to improve situation awareness, and on the other hand, sort of you get these visual cues to avoid motion sickness. And I think in that sense, there will be more opportunities, novel interfaces in automated vehicles, which will enable these tasks. And since those are different, it's not a one-to-one comparison between what passengers do in manually driven vehicles today compared to passengers in automated cars.
Thank you. Chris?
Yeah, I can't see what questions have been typed before because I joined a bit too late, sorry. But I that's why I raised my hand, because I did like this taxi example, and it reminded me anecdotally of my experience in San Francisco. San Francisco was the city where, as a consumer and not as an ethical scientist, as a consumer, I really started to like the Uber driving cabs, because my experience so far was with regular cab drivers who had no incentive at all to drive carefully for me. But San Francisco is very hilly. So with a non-app ordered consumer rated cab driver, the cab drive, you actually couldn't do any activities. But with the Uber driver, where they wanted to make sure that I gave the 5-star rating afterwards, they drove very carefully over every hill and intersection at San Francisco because they knew it would cost their rating. So I'm wondering if we entertain this idea of studying cab drivers that you're having, like, how can you ensure that you have sort of like what I now would call the Uber experience, which doesn't exist in the Netherlands, by the way, for Bastian's study context, right? But the Uber experience and of the Uber customer who can, maybe you can do your activity in the car actually, compared to a cab drive where the cab driver is not that cautious, and where if you were to drink your cup of coffee and you would hit that San Francisco hill, your coffee would spoil on you. So how could you, could an automated vehicle have these different types of experiences, like the very cautious car and the not so cautious car? And how would you at the moment study it with a cab driver? How would it be morally just to instruct the cab driver be a bit more aggressive car driver?
Well, I mean, in a Wizard of Oz car, I would assume you could clearly and easily do that by actually hiring a cab driver on the one hand, say, so drive as you would do usually, and sort of like telling them, hey, so we're under time pressure, so make sure that you reach the train station in 10 minutes, even though it's 20 minutes away. And then as the next thing, sort of you say, oh, you know, I have this very kind of motion sick prone passenger here, and you really need to take care of that person. So make sure that this person arrives there. I think you can really play a lot around the driving style, which actually also is the deception study that we use, that we actually ask the participants to rate different driving styles of the car, which was more or less like the cover story for our case.
Right.
And I think, I mean, what you mentioned, I didn't really think about this rating mechanisms which Uber is using, and that this is one of the main reasons for obviously driving more carefully. I think that's a good approach. So maybe for future studies also, I mean, if you say you want to do that with taxi drivers, you also say sort of like there is basically, I mean, you incentivize this by saying sort of like the people will rate your ride afterwards, and sort of like the better your ride is, the better your compensation is, or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know whether that's true, right? That was my perception, but it was at least up until the point that I started taking the Ubers in the US. It was a very different experience from my cab driving experiences in the Netherlands, where I think I don't think they are all great, the Dutch cab drivers,
No.
but it's perhaps a bit more service oriented, or there's some sort of norm. Because it's not just about how fast is the next ride where you can make some money, but there's also some minimum wage things going on. Anyway, I don't understand the social dynamics of that whole system, but it did feel very different. So yeah.
But I think that's an interesting aspect which we could also kind of keep in mind when designing the next studies.
Very good. Well, Bastian, thank you very much. This was a very interesting conversation, and I think that
my pleasure.
some good ideas for how to move maybe forward in some of these studies. So yeah, thank you for spending the time with us.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation.
I wanted to let you all know that next week we will be back with Erin Solvay. She's at Worcester Polytechnic Institute, so we're looking forward to hosting her. And I'm going to stop recording now, and if you have the time, then please stick around, and we'll have a continued informal conversation with Bastian. So thanks again, Bastian.
Yeah, thanks thanks for listening.